Hello and welcome back, everybody. I'm the Economancer. Today we're going to be exploring the fascinating world of economics, public policy, and cybernetics. So in today's video, we'll be diving into Chapter 4 of an introduction to cybernetics by Ross Ashby. So this chapter covers various concepts related to systems and their functioning and components. So my goal is to try to break this down into manageable sections, help you understand these complex ideas a little bit easier, because this could be considered low grad to high undergrad kind of work. And so if you're just jumping into this, it may be like, whatever. All right. So again, that's the overall goal, is to really understand what's going on in here. And you can see what we're going to be looking at: parameters, transducers, complex transducers, all of this. These are all just words right now. So let's jump into it. So parameter. A parameter is a measurable factor that defines the state of a system, thinking of it as a knob on a control panel that you can turn and adjust the behavior of the system. So by changing the parameter, you can influence the system's property and responses. So the importance of parameters in systems lies in their ability to influence the behavior of the system. By adjusting parameters, we can fine-tune a system to achieve a desired outcome or respond effectively to changes in the environment. So if we're going to take an example, in economics, parameters are like interest rates, tax rates, and unemployment levels. Those can significantly impact the performance of an economy. The ability to manipulate parameters within a system allows us to explore various scenarios and predict the system's responses for changes. So, as an example, central banks can use economic models to simulate the effects of adjusting interest rates on inflation and employment, and this can help guide monetary policy decisions. All right, I think that makes sense. Transducers. All right, so there's a lot of miscommunication about what transducers are. You could have transducer as a device that converts one form of energy or signal into another, but when we're thinking about it in the context of Ashby here, it's very clear he wants to have transducer as a machine with input, which is the name of this chapter. And so if you're trying to think about how to understand systems or relationships between inputs and outputs, and remember, we have this like black box where we have an input set of rules and guidance, and then we have an output, right? For us to understand that machine, we have to understand the machine as a whole. And that's really what the transducer is really trying to be here. So again, in an economics example, we have a tax system, and that can be considered a transducer because there's rules and all of that. Then we have an input data, so that's your income. And then we have a tax liability, that's the outcome. Now, the importance here is when we get into complex transducers for inputs and outputs, right? So let's say that we have an input for factors. So we can have a bunch of these different parameters that are going on. That'll be like income, family size, employment status, and all of these. Then we have policy. This will be welfare policy. And then we factor all of those inputs into the rules of the system, the transducer, boom. Then we have the benefits. And that will be the output. So you can understand and you can see that the set of transformations is defined by the policy, not just the inputs. The inputs are going to be the things that change that lead to the output, but the thing that defines what you'll get is the transducer, is the policy itself. And I think that's really important because a lot of people miss that when they're thinking about it. All right, before we jump into transients and coupling of systems, we're going to talk about input and output real quick. So I'm going to take a step back. Boom. All right. If you have input and output in a system, the input is the data or the signals received from the environment, while the output is response generated by the system. So again, input, output, the system has sets of rules, functions, etc. So the relationship between these two is crucial for understanding how the systems process information and adapt to those changes. So if you're analyzing the relationship between input and output in a system, this can reveal the efficiency of the system. So if we want to potentially improve the system, then we need to understand this input and output between the system. So again, if we think about this in the context of economics, when we consider like how various factors like government spending, monetary policy, international trade, how those all affect GDP growth or inflation rates, the relationship between the input and the output can be applied to various real-world scenarios, such as measuring the efficiency of public policy programs. By examining the resources invested, input, and the desired outcomes, output, we can assess the effectiveness of these programs and identify areas for improvement. And again, it depends on what we're trying to get out of the system itself. It's very important to know that the system itself is a set of rules. And again, this is kind of the Brisbane School of Evolutionary Economics that I'm kind of putting in here, but we'll continue. All right, so transient. So transient refers to a temporary change in a system's behavior as it adjusts to new inputs, output, or new inputs or parameter changes. So transient can be seen as the system's settling period before it reaches a steady state. And now remember, a steady state does not mean static. You have dynamic steady states. But transient means it's from one state to the next before we're moving into the steady state. So that's, again, on a graph, if you're thinking about as we're going, if it's at any point in time doing like a sine function in the middle of a linear movement, then you're probably not at the settling period where you're bouncing between two known values or something along those lines. But transient is really important for understanding what's going on. Now, coupling refers to the connection and interaction between different components or systems. So it's really essential to understand this for coordinating and synchronizing activities within a larger system, but a lot of this is done autonomously. So if you're thinking about coupling, like a bad case of coupling is taking two cars and smashing them together to make a whole car. Like, that doesn't do anything, you've broken it. You have to have interpenetration along some line. And when I get into Luhmann, he really opens this up, because I think Luhmann took this coupling and he took it a lot further when we're talking about like the economic system, the political system, structural coupling along places. All of this is really important for his work, but it's important to understand what we mean by this term coupling of systems. As you can see here, they're coupled on something. All right, feedback loops. I don't know if I really need to explain feedback loops all that much, but feedback occurs when we have systems output influences its input. So that's that circular causation, if you want to say it. So it creates a loop that can either stabilize or destabilize the system. This can lead to self-regulation or amplification of signals, depending on the nature of the feedback. In a broader context, feedback mechanisms are crucial for maintaining balance and stability within systems. So an example is the concept of checks and balances. In a constitutional republic is a form of negative feedback that's designed to prevent any single branch from gaining too much power or destabilizing the system. So executive order comes out, people aren't really big fan of it. Then you have it go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court boots it back down. Now you have a chance where if the people are behind it, then it can become something passed by law, by the legislative body, or it can be something that is negated by the legislative body. But each one of these different systems work against the other to maintain the balance and stability, increase transparency, and stuff of that nature. All right. So we're going to talk about algebraic coupling before we jump into this. So let's look at this like system here. So if you're trying to think about how to model this with math, we have to understand that algebraic coupling is a mathematical way of describing these interactions between different components of a system. So if you're thinking about using algebraic equations, you can think that we're representing the relationships and the dependencies of these various parts of the system. And coupling systems is the process of connecting and coordinating those different systems to create a larger, more complex system. Or it's the place where those two systems share an environment, and because they share an environment, they can share overlap on how they deal with the environmental influence. So if you're really trying to understand the dynamics of coupling within the systems, it helps to recognize the potential synergies or conflicts between these components. And we can do this mathematically, because if we're trying to design public policy that need to take into account these complex interactions between various stakeholders and environmental regulations, then we really need to understand all of those different balances being taken into account. Because again, let's take real estate is a place where we have law structurally coupled to the economic system. So we have the legal system connected to the economic system, and they're structurally coupled at the level of real estate. And so if we're making a real estate law that's a legislative body enacting, it has to understand both the components. It has to understand both of the components there that are structurally coupled from the economic system and the legal system, and it has to understand that in and of itself so it can maintain the proper balance. And so by having these, ways to understand this coupling, so the way components are coupled together is not solely determined by their individual properties, which is something I think I'm going to touch on a little bit later. But we also have to understand those specific interactions and connections that are established between them when we're talking about these connected systems. So here's a discussion on random coupling and the statistical methods of specifying a system. He opens up more, I think, in chapter 7 on this, and it's something that we'll talk about, but I don't want to jump into it too much. But the point here is that we can understand that there are ways of specifying a system from statistical methods by looking at this random sampling of couplings, and we can see that there's a probabilistic relationship between these variables together in a system. So one way to look at it is like co-integration and stuff like that. We can see through some statistical methods where these relationships exist between them through the correlation between variables, and then we can make predictions based on that later down the line to say, okay, we understand that the legal and the economic systems are structurally coupled at real estate because we see the fluctuation between both of these two systems on these components together are highly correlated. So that's one way to think about it. Okay, independence within a whole. So in a complex system, you have some components that can function independently while being a part of a larger interconnected whole. So what this does is allows for greater flexibility and adaptability within the system. So the ability of components to function independently within a large system can lead to greater adaptability, resilience. So if we're thinking about this from the context of public policy, fostering independence between different agencies or departments can encourage innovation and allow for a more tailored response to those local conditions. So you really want to encourage independence within the system so that it can contribute to this overall adaptability and resilience. And so this is something, if you're like a regional economic advisor, you want to promote economic diversification within your region, and thus you reduce dependency on a single interest and making your economy more resistant to external shocks. And if you go back some of my very, very earliest work, I talked about, regional economic models such as the export models. That's really, really important when you're thinking from this economic or this regional economic advisor and how to encourage independence within the system. Another way to think about it is, if you can see this, we have government and then we have agency 1 and agency 2. So the legislative body gives up a certain amount of authority to these agencies so that these agencies can do these jobs. So it's not always being controlled by just the legislative body, and it makes it more efficient by having something that's not necessarily the legislative body running it. So it helps reduce hurdles. Now it says it's supposed to reduce bureaucratic hurdles, but the problem is if you actually read someone like Weber, you'll see that it's the bureaucratic hurdles that actually lead to the reduction of complexity, because those bureaucracies reduce by compartmentalizing that amount of complexity itself. All right, richness of connection. This is very, very good to understand. So The richness of a connection within the system refers to the number of variety of connections between components. So a system with a high degree of connections can exhibit more complex and diverse behaviors, as components can influence and interact with one another in many ways. So the richness of connections within a system greatly influences its behavior and adaptability. Again, much like we were just talking about. So if you're in economics, again, let's say you're a regional advisor, you want to foster rich connections between industries, regions, and then if you can, obviously it's not going to be as applicable, but countries. This can lead to more resilient and robust economies. So by developing these rich connections within the system, we have that increased resilience and adaptability. So cultivating a diverse network of partners in your own system can help you mitigate, economic shocks from outside, because those disruptions, for example, are going to be easier to deal with if you're in a community that's going to foster this collaboration, and it helps enhance your own collective capacity to address, goals within the system that you have to deal with, and you don't want to deal with them all by yourself. And again, this is kind of the key part. The more connections you have, the better it is. And then just in general, the more connections a system has, the better it is. So self-locking properties. So let's talk a little bit about local properties. Local properties are the characteristics of individual components within the system. By understanding the local properties of these components, we can better predict and control the behavior of the system as a whole. Self-locking properties. Some systems exhibit self-locking properties where certain configurations or behaviors become stable and resistant to change. This can be beneficial for maintaining a desired state, but it also may make it difficult for the system to adapt to new inputs or situations. This is unbelievably important when we're talking about social systems and stuff like that, because social systems do have a lot of self-locking properties. Now, you would call them soft self-locking properties. These are norms and values. Like, they're there and they're a part of the configuration, and they motivate those behaviors. And then because they stay locked in, especially through latent pattern maintenance functions, then it's difficult for the system to adapt to other types of behavior. And that's where we have this periphery, or we have this core versus periphery work. If you watch my video on Howard Ennis and how that works on communication bias, but essentially those properties lock in behavior over some period of time. And then you have like laws. Now, all of this is subject to change over time, and it can have radical change, but for the most part, it's a self-locking property, norms and values and stuff like that. So emergence properties and very large systems, right? Again, I'm not sure how much I want to go into this, but if we're talking about very large systems and automata and all of this, systems become larger and more complex. They exhibit properties similar to automata or self-operating machines. And again, this is something Lumen builds off of. So these very large systems can display emergent behaviors and properties that arise from the interactions of their many components. And like I said earlier, if you're trying to actually understand the amount of like this coupling, you can't just look at part A or part B to understand what part C is doing. You have to understand part A, part B, and part C holistically, so you can understand what's going on in each one of those components and where it's structurally coupled. So if we're trying to look at these emergent properties, we're trying to understand and design and manage this complex system more effectively. And this is like a global economy or a large-scale public policy initiative. As the system grows in size and complexity, manage them effectively becomes increasingly challenging. By understanding emergent properties or path-dependent behavior and the behaviors of these large-scale systems, we can better anticipate and respond to those potential challenges. And so a good idea behind this would be the global spread of infectious diseases or systemic risks within financial markets. These are all things that are a part of this very large system and this overall emergent property system, right? And you see here in this graph, we have internet communication, data sharing. They're all three different pieces. So communication obviously came first. And then the internet came to allow for data sharing, but we see now that we have this feedback mechanism between these three, and it's very important to understand how this works and how each one creates its own emergent property within it. Okay, so before I summarize, there's a few more things that I want to talk about here that I thought were really, really important, but I don't have slides for them because I don't think that they needed slides, so you can just listen with me. So we've got feedback as a distinct from dominant relationship. So feedback is different from a dominant relationship. A dominant relationship is X implies Y, and then a feedback is X implies Y implies X, so on and so forth. So while a dominant relationship involves one component exerting control over another, feedback loops are critical in understanding how systems self-regulate and amplify signals. Positive feedback loops can lead to exponential growth, while negative feedback loops contribute to stability. A lot of people get this positive and negative mixed up, but in the case of cybernetics, this is the way we're going to talk about it. So in public policy, for example, feedback mechanisms are essential for assessing the effectiveness of policies and making necessary adjustments. There's a whole piece of the public policy literature that's specifically about stages or life cycles of policy and how we can use feedback to manipulate and motivate changes within the system as it's already starting to take effect. Okay, so now we're going to go to this next one. So we have immediate and ultimate effects is something he talked about. So when changes occur within a system, there can be both an immediate and an ultimate effect. So an immediate effect are things that have direct consequences of a change, where ultimate effects are the long-term outcomes that emerge in the system as it adapts and reorganizes itself. One of those that I really like to point out is like money supply and then inflation. A lot of people think, so if the government tomorrow just pumped the money into the system, that would not immediately lead to, well, it may at this point, but in all cases, it would not always lead to immediate inflation. Because one, there has to be expectations, one, there has to be anticipation, or two, there has to be anticipations. Those two different functions are going into it. And then third, you actually have to have where the rubber meets the road, and that may take anywhere from 6 months to a year. So there's a lot of people out there that look at money supply and then inflation rates, and it's like zero correlation. But if you put a lag or two on it, or maybe up to 5 lags on, you know, money supply and inflation, you start getting really, really, really high correlation, because there's obviously an immediate effect that happens from monetary policy change, and then there's ultimate effects that happen from monetary policy. Another one, reducibility is the ability to break down a complex system into a simpler, more manageable part, right? This is the argument between Walras and Marshall, right? This is general equilibrium models versus partial equilibrium models. And cybernetics, as much as it is like this interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, it really wants to focus on reducibility, which is this partial equilibrium model. By studying these small parts, we can gain a really deep understanding of the overall system. This reducibility allows us to study those smaller components. It allows us to understand and identify points for intervention and improvement. So again, in economics, reducibility can help us understand the intricate relationships between various factors that contribute to economic growth or decline. So breaking down complex systems into their constituent parts helps us identify leverage points for intervention. In the context of climate change, for instance, focusing on specific sectors such as transportation, agriculture, greenhouse gases, those can help us develop targeted strategies for mitigation, or, in what I would suggest, adaptation rather than mitigation. Right, but this, you fundamentally have to have this partial equilibrium analysis and not a general equilibrium analysis to do these reducibility assumptions. And even your general equilibrium models now are reduced by assumptions. Next one is materiality. So materiality refers to the tangible physical aspects of a system. Although cybernetics often deals with these abstract concepts and relationships, it's important to remember that systems have physical components and properties that can impact their behavior. So it's always good to remember that if we're considering material aspects of a system, we have to understand that this is crucial for understanding the limitations and possibilities of that system, right? There's obviously some type of constraint given that resources are finite, right? And this is, again, we're going to pack this into the context of economics and public policy. Material considerations include factors like infrastructure, natural resources, population demographics. If you're not acknowledging these material constraints and resources of the system, then you're failing to plan for realistic, for reality, and then you're not understanding the decision-making processes because these constraints are fundamental. In economics, there's always been a big boom about whether we should even care about utility models or whether we should just use the budget constraint. Like that, there you go. It doesn't matter what's going on. It's just the budget constraint. If you're an urban planner, you have to consider factors like land availability, transportation infrastructure, natural resources, and all of this comes into account. Yeah. And the last thing to really think about here is properties that breed. So in certain systems, some properties or behaviors can give rise to new properties or behaviors. And we already kind of understand this through emergent properties, but we also have to understand that there's breeding that happens. Breeding helps contribute to this process of complexity and adaptability of the systems, because as this property that breeds through the system, it's going to instantiate itself as like a rule that continues further and further and further. One of those I would point out would be like methodological individualism from Adam Smith to now, even though that wasn't the case. I mean, you could actually say it was Enlightenment prior to, but let's just take what the average economist thinks, that methodological individualism up till now. Well, this is kind of like a meme that's just been bred through. It adds complexity and it adds some type of adaptability to the system, but overall it's mostly exogenous to the system. So to conclude this, I hope you understand that this fourth chapter, Machine with an Input, is about concepts and components related to systems and their interactions. By understanding these concepts, we can grasp how complex systems function, adapt, and evolve. So I want you to stay tuned for the next video. It's going to be even more of a fascinating topic. I'm jumping back into the communal ontology again, and then I'm going into stability. And once we get into stability, and then homeostasis and equilibrium, things are going to get wild. And I'm going to enjoy them a lot. But I hope that you have enjoyed this video. Please like, share, subscribe. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please hit me up. I really look forward to it. Thank you.